tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I've said time and time again, free speech is my hill to die on. And that means, legal free speech that is to stand up against censorship and regulation of speech by government, but also academic freedom and cultural free speech. The idea that we must foster in society an attitude that encourages and welcomes the exchange of ideas and information rather than discourages and cancels. And I was, of course, very intrigued by this course that was not offered when I was in university. I'll read the proper name of it because I don't want to give it a crude summation, but the proper name of the course is, and it's a study of woke ideology here, and I lost the thing here. There we go. It is called Woke, the Origins, Dynamics, and Implications of an Elite Ideology. Now, this is not being offered at a Canadian school, not yet, but it is being offered at the University of Birmingham by a Canadian professor, Eric Kaufmann, who joins me now. Professor, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here, Andrew. I should just one slight correction. It's University of Buckingham, not Birmingham.
But Buckingham, I'm so sorry. I get my hams. It was all the Thanksgiving talk. I'm getting my hams mixed up here. Buckingham, yes. And I should say University of Buckingham is like a very, well, you've said it's the only free speech university really in the UK.
It is, yeah. I mean, it has a strange origin because it was founded through Margaret Thatcher, and it sort of, even though most of the staff and students still lean left, it's got more viewpoint diversity than you'll find on a typical British campus. So it's somewhat more hospitable, and the leadership is very much in favor of moving it in this direction.
So what is your class about? I mean, obviously you've got 15 weeks of material here. I don't expect you to give it all in a few minutes, right. But what is this course about?
Well, it really begins with the intellectual history, how did we get to this ideology? How does it relate to, for example, socialism, liberalism, anarchism, and these other isms that go back earlier into the 19th century? And then we kind of look at what happens in the 60s, how the left shifts, from class towards identity, and then how that plays out into our own time. I then move on to looking at public opinion data, sort of who supports something like canceling J.K. Rowling, for example. I mean, it would tend to be younger people. It would tend to be, is it more female than male? Is it more left than right, and so on? And then how this is now affecting electoral politics, the culture wars, the politics of the culture wars, and speech boundaries, critical race theory, all of that. And then finally looking at the philosophy, the questions that it raises, free speech versus so-called equal speech. So that's kind of a very quick and dirty. I mean, it's certainly there on the website. If you go to my Twitter, you can sort of see a link. But we're going to do this sort of very empirically. I mean, there's a lot of academics. There are thousands of papers on the populist right, lots of courses on it. I've taught in that myself. But there's nothing on the woke left because it's just too uncomfortable to do.
One thing I'm curious about, I years ago sought out to write a book about political correctness. And I did years of research on this and just ultimately, for a number of reasons, walked away from it. But one of the things that I found in doing that is that political correctness as a word or as a term, when it was first introduced, was described and used by the people that wanted political correctness, and they wanted to be politically correct. And then it morphed and was only used by people that were decrying it and criticizing it. And am I correct in saying that woke has kind of gone through a bit of a similar phase where it was introduced as a very positive, favorable concept by the woke people, and now they've sort of backed off of the word, and it's only really being used by people that are calling out wokeness?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, what I would say, there's no question people abuse the word and stretch the word to mean anything they don't like.
Some people just use it as a stand-in for left, which I don't think is entirely accurate.
No, I don't think it's accurate, and is somewhat of a way of devaluing what is actually quite a useful, I think, empirically tight social scientific term. So I have a one-sentence definition. It's making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. So once you erect these groups as sacred, anything that might offend the most hypothetically sensitive member of one of these groups is blasphemy, or criticizing anything that's done in the name of helping such as these groups, such as anti-racism or trans affirmation or whatever. If you criticize any such movement, that is also a violation of the sacred and therefore cause for excommunication or cancellation. So there's this very religious quality to it. And I think it is a useful term, and it describes something that is very real and has emerged strongly in our time.
Based on that definition, can wokeness be separated from victimhood and this veneration of victims?
It very much it springs from the victimhood culture. So the wider ideology is based on, you might call it a victimhood culture, and sort of emotional safety, emotional trauma prevention is sort of the mantra. But of course that is broader than just race, gender, sexuality. Could apply to disability, even potentially class. In theory, would fit into the victimhood model, but there is a focus very specifically in wokeness on just race, gender, and sexuality. I think the fat stuff, the class stuff, that doesn't have the same pickup. It doesn't seem like there's as much energy in canceling and pushing for DEI along those axes. So I think it's much more specific to these three categories.
Is your view that the woke, whoever they are, and maybe that's something you want to define, do they see wokeness as a tool, as a vehicle to get to where they want, or is it the destination?
I think it is the destination. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has his moral foundations theory, and there's really two foundations. One is equal outcomes, so all identity groups, that could be black, white, male, female, etc., should have equal outcomes in terms of income, in terms of honors and esteem, and so on. That would be one prong of it. The other prong is, again, this microscopic, even microaggression, sort of harm protection. So anything that might offend or upset in any way somebody's emotional state
Hmm.
must be prevented, which is why they're going after free speech, for example, which might offend, right? So I think there is something real there and is rooted in these two moral foundations, but just taken to the extreme.
Your description of it as making sacred, I think, is incredibly appropriate because a lot of people have seen that religious like fervor from people who, again, would identify as fundamentally anti religion in a lot of
Right.
cases and would talk about the harm of religion against certain groups. And it's interesting how blind they are to what this does to several groups and people as well. And I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about that because by making it sacred, you have to elevate it above other things that have had a level of sanctity in society. Freedom of speech is a notable one. I mean, it used to be that even people who are fairly progressive would still operate within the parameters of free speech is important. And, they'd use free speech to make their point. That was, I think, the dominant force you saw in progressives for much of the last 50 years. And now, freedom of speech no longer has any sacred value. In fact, it's viewed as an evil that needs to be dealt with in society by a lot of these people.
Yeah, and that's been documented in opinion survey data in the US going back to the 70s, that there's been a shift from kind of a more moral relativism, toleration, to moral absolutism in young
Hmm.
people. Um, but I don't want to. I think it's a mistake to see this as completely new. And I think, if you talk about political correctness in the 80s and 90s, um, was it acceptable to offend minority groups in the late 80s and early 90s? No, is the answer. They
Hmm.
had speech codes at US universities. I actually think you already had a pretty restrictive speech climate. The doors were kind of, I think, pretty wide open. And that's why you did see episodes of cancel culture. The UBC Political Science Department in the mid 1990s was just one episode. It just was less frequent because you didn't have social media to organize flash mobs. So
But
I'm
if I
not.
if I could if I could jump in though, Professor, I feel that what happened there, you're right. The acceptability was already established, or the unacceptability. I feel what happened is the threshold was changed. Is that what offense was redefined, and I wonder if that's the goalpost shift that leads us to where we are now as well. The same idea. I mean, being a racist has been out of vogue for many decades, but the definition of racism has changed a lot in that time.
True, true. I mean, I think you're right. The idea of hiking being racist and punctuality being a white thing, that is there's no question that they've taken it to the next level.
Hmm.
The only thing I would say though is you can find examples, in the mid 70s, evolutionary psychologists who argued that genetics mattered, and this wasn't race IQ, this was just genetics mattering for social behavior. They were ostracized, they had open letters. So even though you're right that there's been some new conceptual stretching, I think quite a bit of that had already occurred. And certainly in
Hmm.
academia, if you look at the published work already in the 70s and 80s and 90s, critical race theory dates from the 70s. Chris Rufo in his book talks about this. So these ideas were already there. It's just that they hadn't spread as widely. And yes, there were some innovations. The trans thing is new, but I would stress the continuities more than the discontinuities. Social media, it's more quantitative scaling up rather than a qualitative change, in my view.
One of the challenges that I would have, and again, I'm basing this off of how I've used woke, not necessarily the parameters that you've set for it, is that there's a prevailing theme in it, and there are commonalities in how it's applied. But is it as coherent? Is it coherent enough to be an ideology in the sense that do the woke apply the rules they set equally in your view? If someone's committed to wokeness, do you find that they're consistently applying it, or do you think that there are inconsistencies in that?
Well, I think if you narrow it to the sort of sacred categories, then it's pretty consistently applied. So any time there is a disparity in outcome between white and black, let's say in terms of entering Harvard or in terms of wealth, they will be on top of that. If there are more black people being incarcerated or excluded from school, they'll be on top of that. Now, what they won't apply that to is, for example, if Jews are doing better than Gypsy and Irish travelers here in Britain, or if West Indians or sort of West Africans are doing better than West Indians within the black group, they don't care about those distinctions. So because those distinctions aren't the sacred ones. So I'd say they're being inconsistent in ignoring a lot of different social categories where there are inequalities of outcome.
Mhm.
But on their sacred categories, I think they're applying those fairly consistently. So the rules are simply,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm just like look in Canada, as you're well aware. In the last few weeks, we've had the boiling point in the parental rights movement, where we've had trans activists and Muslim activists that are in conflict. And generally speaking, I'd say the woke left has sided with the trans activists, despite the Muslims being their sacred cows for much of the last 20 years. So I'm just curious, with your approach to this issue, how you would explain that phenomenon.
Well, there is a sort of hierarchy of oppression points. There's the top of the totem pole, and then there's the white male cis hetero type at the very bottom of the
Yeah, I don't
totem
stand
pole.
a chance.
No. So the question then is, right, is who's got more points? Is it the
Hmm.
Muslims who have more points, or is it trans who have more points? And I think it's as simple as trans having more points. It's just like trans gets more points than feminist, and female. And I think it's as simple as that: is who is seen as punching up and who's seen as punching down. I don't think it's more complicated really than that. And of course, what matters are those sacred categories: race, gender, sexuality, and it's just who has more points.
So I'm just curious, and I don't know the student profile at the University of Buckingham, but what would you love to see in your class? What's the enrollment profile of your class you'd absolutely love here? Because I think secretly or maybe openly you might like the really like woke lefty non-binary with the purple hair student in there having it out with someone who loves free speech and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think ideally it would be 50-50. I mean, a lot of the data we have from FIRE in the US would show, when you have a roughly 50-50 mix, you've got the least self-censorship going on.
Mhm.
I'd only want, I would want somebody who was woke, and I want plenty of left wingers. I don't want it to be an echo chamber. Um, if we could get somebody in there who was woke, but who was willing to defend it in a Socratic style, to say, well, I think equality trumps liberty, and this is important for human flourishing, or the speech boundaries should be much tighter than they are. I mean, I think that kind of debate would be really interesting. The problem, of course, is when you get people who just stick a label on others and think, okay, they're toxic,
Yeah.
and I'm going to be polluted by hanging out with them, and so no, we have to no platform. I mean, once you're into that or emotional blackmail, then it's not productive.
Yeah, or someone who feels unsafe in the climate
Yeah,
of ideas, which is not an issue I hope you'll have to contend with in your new university home here.
I
Professor
hope
Eric
not.
Professor Eric Kaufmann, I wish you the best with the class. Maybe we'll find some great essays you've done that we can publish over at True North for some of your students. But thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.